He gave the order under a blood-red moon, and the whole pack held its breath. Alpha King Ryker Blackthorn, feared across 7 territories, unbowed by war or winter, stood before his pregnant mate and spoke 2 words that shattered everything he'd built. Leave. Now. No trial. No mercy. No second look at the woman carrying his bloodline into the world. What kind of man does that? What kind of king? Stay until the end, because the answer will wreck you. Drop your city in the comments below. Let your pack know you're here. The blood moon rose the way catastrophe always rises, slow at first, then all at once. It had been climbing the eastern ridge for 2 hours before anyone in Silverfang territory noticed the color was wrong. Moons turned red during eclipses, during wildfire smoke, during the particular angle of late autumn when the atmosphere pressed low and thick over the mountain range. Every elder in the pack could name you 6 reasons a moon went red. None of them, not a single one among the gray-bearded lieutenants who had served 3 alpha generations and buried 2, could explain why this particular red felt like a warning instead of a weather pattern. Morella, the oldest healer, said nothing when she stepped outside her stone cottage and looked up. She just went back inside and put water on to boil, and her apprentice, who had known her for 11 years, understood this was not because Morella expected to need hot water. It was because Morella needed to do something with her hands. In the great hall of the Blackthorn stronghold, the chandeliers burned low. Iron fixtures strung with 100 candles, the wax half spent, the flames guttering in the drafts that pushed through the old stone walls no matter how many gaps got stuffed with mortar. The hall could seat 400 warriors at long wooden tables. Tonight it held 40, and the sound of their breathing filled the space like something alive and uneasy. Ryker Blackthorn stood at the head of the Alpha's table. He was not sitting. He had not sat in 3 hours. He was 31 years old, built like something that had been hammered rather than born, wide through the shoulders, long in the arms, with hands that had broken jaws and set fence posts. And once, when he was 19 and newly ascended and running on nothing but rage and terror, crushed a wolf's skull against the stone floor of this very hall to end a challenge before it properly began. His face showed the specific damage of a man who had never once in his adult life stepped back from a fight he believed in. A scar ran jaw to temple on the left side, white and old, from a blade he'd almost been too slow to dodge. His nose had been broken twice and set badly once, which gave his profile a slightly crooked quality that his beta described with characteristic tact as distinguished. His eyes were the color of river ice in January, pale gray-blue, almost colorless in certain lights, with the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself to reveal nothing. He was revealing everything right now, and he couldn't stop. His second Caius vein stood 6 feet away and pretended to examine the ring of candles on the table. Caius had wide, reliable shoulders and a face built for trustworthiness. Square jaw, open brow, the kind of steady brown eyes that made people lean toward him in a crisis. He'd been Ryker's beta for 8 years. He knew when to talk and when to become furniture. This was a furniture moment. The hall doors opened. Celine Ashvale walked in. She was 5 months along, and she carried it the way she carried everything, with a posture that refused apology. She was small by pack standards, fine-boned through the wrists and throat, but there was a density to her stillness that had nothing to do with size. Her hair was dark, nearly black, pulled back in a braid that had started the evening neat, and was now coming loose at the temple. She wore a gray wool dress, belted at the waist, and the moon ring on her left hand caught the candlelight, silver and moonstone, the Luna's mark, given to her on the night Ryker had claimed her before the entire assembled pack 14 months ago. Her face was composed. Her hands, down at her sides, were not quite steady. She had been summoned. She hadn't been told why. She crossed the hall without rushing, her boots quiet on the stone floor, and she didn't look at the 40 warriors who had gone so still they barely seemed to breathe. She looked at Ryker. He looked at her for a moment that lasted too long. Then he looked away. "Close the doors," he said. They closed. Celine Ashvale. He used her birth name instead of her bonded name, and the room understood what that meant before any word of accusation had been spoken. "You've been brought before the pack on a charge of treason against Silverfang territory." The silence that followed was absolute. Celine stood still. Something moved across her face. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to the particular cold clarity that descends when a person realizes, in a single suspended moment, that a situation is far worse than they understood when they walked into the room. "Say that again," she said quietly. "You heard me. I heard you use a word that carries a death sentence in this territory." Her voice was level. "I want to hear you say it again clearly in front of witnesses because I want to be certain I understand what's being accused." Ryker's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped below his ear. "Treason. Against Silverfang. Against the Alpha Line. On what evidence?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, 2 pages, dense with handwriting, sealed at the top with a red wax impression Celine recognized. The border correspondence seal of the Ashvale family territory, 140 miles northeast. He set it on the table without moving toward her. "Messages," he said, "intercepted at the northeast gate 3 days ago, addressed from you to your father's house, detailing patrol schedules, rotation cycles, the location of our southern watchtower that we built in secret last spring." Celine looked at the pages. She did not move toward them. "I didn't write those. The handwriting has been verified." "By whom?" "2 of my senior officers." "Who were those officers?" "That information isn't—" "Who were they?" The steadiness in her voice cracked open a fraction, not into panic, but into something harder and more precise. "You're accusing me of treason. You're standing in front of 40 witnesses. The least you can do is name the men who put my handwriting on those pages, because if they exist and they verified anything, they can stand here and say so to my face." Caius Vane, 6 feet away, studying candles, did not move. Ryker said, "Elder Macon and Lieutenant Greaves." "Greaves?" She repeated the name carefully. "The same Lieutenant Greaves who applied for a hunting tract on Ashvale land 2 years ago and was denied by my father. That has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with this." She took 1 step toward him and stopped. "Ryker, look at me." He looked at her. "You've known me for 2 years," she said. "You've shared my bed. You know how I write. You know my hand. Get those pages and read them yourself, and then tell me with your own eyes that I wrote those words." A long beat passed. He didn't move toward the pages. Something shifted in the room. A collective held breath. The warriors at the long tables not looking at each other because none of them wanted to be the one caught looking. Caius Vane said very quietly, "Alpha." Ryker turned to him. "There's more." Caius's voice was even, measured, the voice of a man delivering information he had verified carefully and regretfully. He moved to the table and set down a second document, smaller, a single page. "This was found in the Luna's private rooms during the search conducted yesterday evening, while she was at the healer's for her monthly check." Celine's head turned sharply. "You searched my rooms. Standard procedure for an active investigation." "I wasn't informed of any investigation. You couldn't risk telling me that my rooms were being searched." The composure cracked another fraction and sealed itself back up. "What was found?" Caius didn't answer. He looked at Ryker. Ryker picked up the single page. His jaw was working. He read it without speaking, and whatever was on it stripped something from his face that Celine had never seen stripped away. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the particular devastation of a man who had been holding on to a possibility that the document in his hands was now erasing. He set it down. "It's a promise of alliance," he said, "between the Ashvale House and the Iron Hollow Pack, promising safe passage and intelligence support in exchange for territorial concessions in the Eastern Valley once—" He stopped. "Once what?" "Once the Blackthorn line ends." The hall was absolutely silent. Celine looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet the men in the back of the hall had to lean forward to catch it. "You believe that?" "The evidence. I'm not asking you about evidence. I'm asking whether you, standing here looking at me, believe that I would conspire to end the Blackthorn line while I am carrying a child that is half Blackthorn." She pressed one hand flat against the curve of her belly, a gesture so simple and involuntary that half the room flinched from it. "I'm asking if you believe I would do that to this child. Your child." The silence stretched. Ryker looked at her hand against her belly. He looked away. I don't know what I believe, he said. That's the problem. Then we have a very different problem than the one you described when you called me a traitor. Luna. The word came from the end of the table. Old Elder Macon, gray-bearded, barrel-chested, with the careful neutrality of a man who had survived 3 regime changes by never appearing to take sides. The evidence is substantial. The Alpha has a duty to the pack. The Alpha has a duty to the truth, Celine said, without looking at him. Her eyes stayed on Ryker, which is not the same thing. Ryker said, You'll be given time to answer the charges. How much time? Silence. Ryker. The blood moon is tonight, he said. He was looking at the wall now, at the old tapestry depicting the first Blackthorn Alpha standing over a conquered rival, wolves at his feet, sky red above. Under blood moon law, a charge of treason against a bonded mate must be answered within the lunar cycle. Celine stared at him. That law hasn't been invoked in 60 years. It's still law. It was written for a different time, for situations where the pack was actively under siege, where there was no time for the pack is under siege. He turned then, finally, and looked at her directly. His voice was flat and controlled, and something beneath it sounded like a man standing on ice he's not certain will hold. We've lost 3 border scouts in the last month. The southern watchtower was compromised. Someone knew the rotation. Someone with access to information that only reaches the highest level of this command. If that someone is in this room, you know I'm not the someone in this room. I don't know anything right now. The flatness broke for just a second, a crack barely visible in the ice-colored eyes. That's what's destroying me. Then investigate. Her voice stayed quiet, but something in it sharpened to a point. Take the time you need. Take a week. Take 2. Lock me in my rooms if you have to while you dig. But don't stand in front of 40 witnesses and invoke a blood moon tribunal when you don't actually believe I'm guilty. Because once you say those words, Ryker, you can't take them back. You know that. He said nothing. Elder Macon said, Alpha, the pack is watching. And there it was. The thing that mattered, underneath everything else. The pack was watching. 40 warriors in this hall and 200 more outside it. And beyond those, the 7 territories that recognized the Blackthorn name. And beyond those, the rival packs that circled Silverfang land like wolves around a campfire, waiting for the first sign of weakness, the first crack in the structure, the first moment when the Alpha of Silverfang showed something other than absolute certainty. Ryker Blackthorn had built his authority on the fact that he was never uncertain, not publicly, not where anyone could see. He stood there, with his ice-colored eyes and his broken nose and his silence, and for 7 seconds, Celine counted them, he looked at her. Then he looked at Caius. Caius met his eyes, and something passed between them, and Caius looked at the floor. Celine Ashvale, Ryker said. His voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go before, somewhere below emotion, below decision, into the register of a man who has already paid the price and is simply reading the receipt. By the authority of the Alpha Throne, under blood moon law, and in the presence of these witnesses, I find the evidence of your betrayal sufficient to warrant immediate action. The floor moved under her feet. It didn't, but her body insisted it had. You are hereby stripped of your title and rank as Luna of Silverfang, the moon ring on her left hand, the moonstone catching the light. You are banished from Silverfang territory effective immediately into the forbidden forest beyond the eastern ridge. Somewhere in the hall a warrior made a sound, quickly swallowed, quickly buried, but it was there. Celine heard it. You are to cross the tree line before the blood moon reaches its zenith. Any attempt to return to Silverfang land will be treated as an act of hostility and answered accordingly. She stood very still. Do you understand, he said, what's been decided? The word decided. Not asked, not accused, decided. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the warriors at the long tables began to look at their hands, their boots, the grain of the wood, anywhere but at the Luna's face while she absorbed the verdict. Then she said very quietly, yes. She turned and walked toward the hall doors. No performance in it, no dramatics. just her boots on stone and the slight shift in her posture that came from a body carrying extra weight at the front, and the braid coming loose a little more at her temple, and her hands down at her sides. She stopped at the doors. Without turning, make sure there's a record of who verified those documents, by name, time-stamped. A pause. When you figure out what actually happened, and you will eventually, you're going to want to know exactly where to look. Then she walked through the doors, and they closed behind her. In the hall, nobody spoke for a very long time. Old Elder Macon cleared his throat. The Alpha has decided. The pack... Get out, Ryker said. Macon blinked. Alpha, all of you. Out. They filed out. 40 warriors, none of them looking at him, the way men look away from an accident while it's still happening, the instinct to give the wreckage some privacy. Caius was the last to reach the door. Caius. The beta stopped. Tell me I'm right. Ryker's voice was very quiet and very even and entirely unlike his voice. Tell me the evidence is real. Caius stood with his back to the room for a moment. The evidence is what it is, he said. You read it yourself. Then he left. Ryker stood alone in the hall with the guttering candles and the ancient tapestry and the 2 documents on the table, and outside the high narrow windows the blood moon climbed the sky with the slow, indifferent patience of something that had watched 100 kings make catastrophic decisions and would watch 100 more. He did not look at the documents again. He did not go after her. Celine walked. She did not run. Running conceded something she refused to concede. The stronghold corridors were stone and torchlight, wide enough for 3 people abreast, and at this hour they should have held the usual evening foot traffic. Warriors rotating to night posts, servants carrying the last of the dinner service back to the kitchens, pups running errands for their senior fighters with the particular scrambling energy of young things that haven't learned yet to modulate themselves. Instead, they held silence. Word traveled in a pack the way fire travels, not slowly. The people she passed either looked away or looked at her with the specific expression of people who want to say something and have calculated the cost of saying it and found the cost too high. A kitchen girl, 16 or 17, pressed herself flat against the wall as Celine passed, and then, when Celine was 4 paces past her, said in a very small voice, "Luna." Celine didn't stop. She said, "Go inside, sweetheart," and kept walking. Her own rooms were in the east wing, up a staircase and down a corridor that always smelled of the cedar they packed the linens with. She'd complained about the cedar smell for the first 3 months, and then somewhere along the way it had become the smell of home without her noticing. The rooms had been searched. She could tell before she crossed the threshold, the particular quality of a space that has been handled by people who were looking for something. Drawers not quite flush, books replaced in the wrong order. Her jewelry box on the left side of the dresser when she always kept it on the right. She stood in the middle of her room and made herself breathe. 5 months. She was 5 months along. The child moved sometimes in the evenings, a soft flutter that she'd only recently started to distinguish from other internal sensations. And she pressed her hand there now, standing in the middle of the searched room, and waited to feel it. Nothing. Which didn't mean anything. The child had its own schedule, its own indifference to her needs. She gave herself 45 seconds. Then she began to pack. Not much. A pack, not a trunk. She wasn't going to carry something she couldn't run with, because the Forbidden Forest was called that for reasons that predated the current regime by 2 centuries, and whatever those reasons were, she intended to be able to move. Warm clothes. The heaviest ones she had. Extra socks. That was the thing people forgot in situations like this, the thing that killed you quietly over 3 or 4 days. Wet socks. A flint kit. A belt knife. The one she'd carried since she was 12 and her father's huntmaster had taught her to field dress a deer with the particular efficient brutality that kept you alive in lean winters. What food she had in the room. Dried fruit, a heel of hard cheese, half a bag of salted nuts. She looked at the moon ring on her left hand. She took it off. She looked at it for a moment, the silver worn shiny at the inner curve where it sat against her skin, the moonstone milky and pale in her palm. She placed it on the center of the dresser. Then she shouldered the pack and left the room and didn't look back. The gate guards at the eastern wall were two young warriors she knew. Petra, who had a new baby of her own and had brought Celine sweet root tea twice during her first trimester, and Donal, who was 23 and had grown up on the Ashevale border, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, still got homesick in the particular way of young men who haven't lived away from their mother's cooking long enough to pretend they didn't miss it. They were standing at their posts with the stiff, deliberate blankness of soldiers following an order they found deeply uncomfortable. Celine stopped in front of them. "Petra," she said, "how's the baby?" Petra's jaw worked. "Fine, Luna, she's fine." "Good." A pause. "Open the gate." Donal opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Luna," he said. "The forest. I know what the forest is." She wasn't unkind about it. "Open the gate, Donal." They opened it. She walked through. Behind her, she heard the gate close, and then she was nearly to the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, when she heard it. Petra's voice, low and fierce and furious, not meant for Celine's ears, but audible anyway. "This is wrong." And Donal, even quieter. "I know." Celine reached the trees. She walked in. The Forbidden Forest was old. Old in the way mountains are old. Not a category of years, but a category of weight. The trees here were fir and black pine, enormous specimens that had been growing since before the first blackthorn claimed this territory, their bark thick and ridged, their canopy so dense that the blood moon was reduced to suggestions and fragments overhead rather than actual light. The undergrowth was dense with root systems and fallen branches, and the particular clutching grab of low brush that seemed designed to catch ankles. Celine moved carefully and steadily and did not let herself think about the things the forest was known for. Not the stories. Those were children's stories, and she was not a child. But the real things. The drop in temperature that could hit lethal by deep night in late autumn, the broken terrain, the possibility of wolves from the border packs that didn't recognize Silverfang authority and wouldn't care about hers in any case. She moved until the stronghold lights were out of sight. Then she stopped and found a root structure big enough to sit against and sat down and put her back to the bark and pressed her hand against her belly and this time, after a moment, felt the flutter there. Small and unmistakable and entirely unconcerned with the catastrophe surrounding it. She sat with that for a while. In the trees above her, something moved. An owl, or the wind, or nothing. She thought about Ryker's face when she'd said, "You know my hand." The way he had not moved toward the documents. The way he had said, "I don't know what I believe," as if the uncertainty itself was a betrayal he hadn't chosen. She thought about the two documents, the signatures, the seals. Her handwriting was distinctive. She'd been told that since she was a girl, her father's scribes had commented on it. The particular way she formed her lowercase letters with an extra loop at the close, the way her capital S curved slightly to the left. Distinctive meant recognizable. It also meant reproducible. She thought about Lieutenant Greaves, who had wanted hunting rights on Ashevale land and been denied. She thought about Elder Macon and the particular careful neutrality of his voice in the hall. The way a man performs neutrality to achieve invisibility. She thought, someone built this very carefully. Then she stopped thinking about the stronghold and made herself think about the forest instead, because the forest was real and present and going to kill her if she sat against this root until shock set in and her body heat bled into the ground. She needed shelter, water, fire, if she could manage it without advertising the position. In the morning, she needed to move deeper, not because deeper was safer, necessarily, but because the border of the Forbidden Forest was the first place they'd look if Ryker changed his mind and sent anyone after her. And she did not intend to be caught at the edge of something like an animal that had run only far enough to feel safe. She was not safe. She was 5 months pregnant and alone in a forest that had killed trained adults on 3 documented occasions in the last decade, carrying a child who would need food and warmth and a mother who was functional rather than frozen. And the blood moon overhead was the most beautiful and terrible thing she had ever seen. She got up. She found water by sound, a narrow creek cutting through the root systems to the northeast, and she marked the direction. She found a natural lean-to in the form of 2 fallen trees crossing at a useful angle. The downfall covering an area large enough to shelter a person of her size from wind and the worst of precipitation. She cleared the ground inside it with her boots and her hands, working methodically in the fragmentary moonlight, and pulled bracken into the space for insulation and crawled in. She did not light a fire. She lay on her side with her pack at her back and one hand resting on her belly and looked at the gap in the bracken where she could see a slice of sky between the canopy, and the blood moon sat in that gap like something watching. "We're going to be fine," she said quietly to the flutter under her hand. "He's going to figure it out. He's not stupid." A pause. "He was stupid tonight, but he's not stupid." Another pause, longer. "We're going to be fine." The flutter moved. Once, distinctly, then was still. She closed her eyes. Back in the stronghold, Caius Vane walked the long corridor to the Alpha's study with the particular unhurried quality of a man in no danger of being accused of haste. He had learned over many years the importance of appearing to have no particular destination. Men who moved with purpose got remembered. Men who strolled got forgotten. He let himself into the study with the key Ryker had given him 8 years ago, trusting completely and without condition, the way Ryker did everything he trusted. The study was empty. Ryker was still in the hall. Caius had seen him through the doorway as he passed, standing at the window with the blood moon painting him red and the 2 documents on the table behind him untouched. Caius went to the desk. He opened the 3rd drawer on the left. Beneath the territorial maps, beneath the duty rosters, he felt along the inner base of the drawer until his fingers found the false bottom, installed 12 years ago by a previous Alpha who had been, according to pack legend, pathologically secretive. Ryker had never found it. Ryker was many things, but he was not a man who looked under surfaces. That quality had been extremely useful. Caius withdrew the document from beneath the false bottom and unfolded it. He had written it himself over the course of 3 weeks, practicing Celine's handwriting from her personal correspondence. The kitchen notes she wrote in her precise and distinctive hand, the border trade agreements she'd countersigned in her role as Luna. 3 weeks of slow, methodical practice until his version was indistinguishable from hers to anyone who wasn't Celine herself. He had forged better things in his life. He was not proud of this particular forgery, but pride had never been the relevant variable. He refolded the document and placed it back under the false bottom. Then he straightened, closed the drawer, and stood in the middle of the study for a moment with his hands in his pockets and the blood moon outside the window painting the stone floors the color of old blood. He had told Greaves the handwriting had been verified by Macon and himself. He had told Macon the same thing in reverse. Neither man had actually compared the documents to Celine's authentic writing samples. They had trusted Caius's assessment because Caius was the beta, and the beta's assessment was trustworthy. That was, ultimately, what 8 years of being trustworthy purchased. He walked to the window and looked out at the eastern edge of the territory where the forbidden forest was a black mass against the red sky. And somewhere in there, small, alone, 5 months along, was the woman he'd spent 3 months eliminating. He had nothing against Celine Ashvale personally. That was important to him. Not that it changed anything, but that he held on to it. He had nothing against her. She was, by most measures, an admirable person. She had not deserved what happened tonight in the hall. But she was the only piece he hadn't been able to control, the only variable that could theoretically piece together the pattern of what was happening to Silverfang from the inside. Because she was smart and she was careful, and she was in a position to be believed. Ryker would never have credited her with his own counsel's corruption, but Celine might have seen it. Celine had, in fact, almost seen it. The question she'd asked in the hall, who verified the documents by name, had been exactly the right question. 3 months earlier than he'd anticipated, but exactly right. He needed her gone. The forbidden forest was not a guarantee. He turned from the window and left the study and walked back toward the hall, composing his face into the appropriate expression for a man going to check on a grieving Alpha. Behind him, in the eastern distance, the blood moon hung full and terrible and red over the tree line, illuminating nothing, watching everything. 6 days later, the first of the border scouts came back. He was not supposed to be alive. He came in through the southern gate just after dawn on a frost-white morning with leaves down and the first hard freeze making the ground brittle underfoot. And 2 night rotation warriors found him collapsed 40 feet inside the gate with mud on his face and a wound in his side that had been clumsily packed with forest moss to slow the bleeding, the way a man packs a wound when he's the only one available to pack it. His name was Aldrich. He was 26. He had been assigned to a 3-man border rotation that had disappeared without a trace 23 days ago, one of the losses Ryker had cited in the hall as evidence that the pack was under siege. He was alive because the people who had taken him had made the particular operational error of assuming that a man with a gut wound, bound in a root cellar in the deep woods 60 miles from home, was a man who would die of the wound or the cold or the isolation before the ropes became a relevant problem. They had been wrong. Ryker was in the Alpha's study when they brought Aldrich in. He came down to the infirmary himself with Caius half a step behind and stood at the foot of the cot while the healer worked, and Aldrich, gray-white and running a fever already, looked up at him with the exhausted focus of a man who has been rehearsing a speech for 3 weeks and is not going to waste it. "They knew our rotation," Aldrich said. His voice was rough and wet. "They were waiting at our 3rd checkpoint, knew exactly when we'd be there, how many of us, which direction we'd be coming from. Who took you? Men. Not pack markings. No colors. Paid work." A pause while the healer pressed at the wound and Aldrich shut his eyes briefly. "Mercenary company, operating out of the north. They had a handler, someone who was paying them and giving them our intelligence." "Did you see the handler?" Aldrich looked at him. "I heard him," he said. "In the root cellar, through the floor, voice only." Ryker leaned forward. "And it was—" Aldrich's voice cut out. He swallowed hard. "I know that voice. I've heard it 100 times in 8 years. He was talking about the Luna, about needing to confirm she'd entered the forest." A breath, ragged. "About making sure she didn't come back out." The room was very still. Ryker said, "Say his name." Aldrich looked at him. There was something in the scout's exhausted face. Not reluctance, exactly. Something closer to the particular sorrow of a person who has spent 3 weeks knowing something terrible and now has to put it into the world where it can't be taken back. "Say it," Ryker said again. Aldrich said the name. And in the doorway behind Ryker, 2 steps back and half out of the light, Caius Vane went very, very still. Gut Abend. In the Forbidden Forest 5 miles east of the stronghold wall, Celine Ashvale opened her eyes in the gray pre-dawn and felt the child move. Not the flutter she'd known for weeks, but something stronger, something that felt like urgency, and sat up in the bracken and heard, in the deep silence of the trees, the sound of footsteps. More than one set, moving without haste, coming toward her. She reached for her belt knife. She had not been careful enough. The footsteps were not hurrying. That was the thing that told her the most. Not the number of them, not the direction, but the pace. People who were hunting moved with urgency or moved with stealth. These footsteps moved with the specific, unhurried quality of people who did not believe their quarry was capable of running. Celine was on her feet before the thought fully formed. The belt knife was in her hand. The pack was on her back in 4 seconds. She'd slept with the straps loosened but not removed, a decision she'd made on the second night and held to since. Her boots were already on. In the years before the stronghold, before the Luna title and the wool dresses and the cedar-scented rooms, her father's huntmaster had told her, "In uncertain country, you sleep ready. You don't sleep comfortable. Comfort is a thing you earn after the threat is resolved, not before." She moved away from the lean-to in the opposite direction of the footsteps, low and quiet through the bracken, testing each step before she committed her weight. The frost made the ground brittle and loud if you hit it wrong. She didn't hit it wrong. There were 3 of them. She counted by sound, the intervals between footfalls, the way 3 separate rhythms overlapped and separated. They had torches, which told her they were not trying to be invisible, which told her they were not afraid of what the torchlight might attract, which told her they were confident in their numbers or their backing or both. She put a root system between herself and the light and went still. The torches swept the lean-to. She heard one of them say something low and another respond, and the third make a sound that wasn't words, just confirmation, the grunt of a man who has found what he was looking for and is now considering the next step. "She was here." The first voice. A man, middle-aged by the sound of it, with the flat affect of someone who narrates facts rather than reacting to them. Professional. Recent. Bracken still pressed. How recent? Hour, maybe less. A pause. She can't have gone far. This voice was younger, with an edge of contempt in it that sounded like inexperience. She's 5 months along and it's been 6 days. She'll be slowing down. The first man said, "Don't assume what a cornered person can do." Celine pressed her back against the root system and felt the cold of it through her coat and thought, good advice. She had maybe 40 seconds before they spread out and the torchlight covered the gap between her position and the next available cover. She looked at the terrain, the creek to the northeast, which she knew, the dense pine stand to the south, which she didn't, the broken slope to the west, which was loud with loose shale and would announce her position to anyone within 100 yards. She went south, into the dark, into the unfamiliar, because the unfamiliar was at least equally unknown to the people behind her, and that was the only equity available. She ran, not the run of panic. Panic killed you, turned your ankle on a root, drove you into a branch at face height. The run of controlled urgency, deliberate foot placement, the breath she'd learned to regulate from her huntmaster on exactly these terms. You run on the exhale. You recover on the inhale. You do not let your lungs make the decision. She kept her left hand in front of her face against branches. She kept the torchlight in her peripheral vision, tracking it, measuring distance by the way it diminished. The child in her belly was a weight that shifted her center of gravity in ways she was still learning, 5 months in. She compensated. The body learns fast when the alternative is falling. Behind her, she heard the young voice shout something. Then the torches spread, separating, and she understood they were fanning out, and she pushed harder. The pine stand swallowed her. She went to ground between two close-growing trunks, flat on her stomach in the pine duff, her face against the cold earth, and she made herself breathe on schedule, in, out, controlled, silent, and she listened. The torches swept wide, too wide. They'd lost the direction. She lay there for a very long time. When the lights were gone and the footsteps had faded and the forest had returned to its particular quality of inhabited silence, she got up. She kept moving south. She was not going to survive this by being found again. Aldrich said the name, and the infirmary went the kind of quiet that has texture to it. Not empty quiet, but the specific density of a room full of people who have just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Ryker heard it. He heard it the way you hear something that confirms a fear you have been refusing to name. Not with surprise exactly, but with the particular cold settling of a thing that has been true for longer than you knew and is only now becoming visible, like frost that has been building on a surface all night, and you only see it when the light hits it right. He turned. Caius was in the doorway, 2 steps back, half out of the light, with the expression of a man who has been caught not in an action, but in the cessation of one, the stillness of a person who has stopped performing naturalness because the performance has just become irrelevant. For 8 years, Ryker had known that face. He had read it in councils and in crisis, and in the particular intimacy of men who fight beside each other and share food and hold each other's operational lives in their hands. He knew every register of that face. He did not recognize what was on it now. "Caius," he said. The beta said nothing. "Tell me Aldrich is wrong." The healer had gone very still at her table. The 2 warriors who'd carried Aldrich in were at the far wall, not moving. Aldrich himself had stopped watching Ryker and was watching Caius, with the expression of a man who has delivered a grenade and is now waiting to see what the radius is. Caius said, "I need you to listen to me." "That's not what I asked you." "I know." The beta's voice was even, controlled. The voice of a man who had prepared for this, had mapped this particular terrain in advance, and knew where he intended to stand. "What I'm asking is for you to listen before you decide what to do next. Because what you do in the next 5 minutes is going to determine the next 5 years, and you have a history of don't." Ryker's voice dropped to something that barely qualified as sound. "Don't tell me what my history is. Someone has to. Not you." He crossed the infirmary in 8 steps, and Caius didn't move, which told Ryker something. The man had decided not to run, which meant either he had calculated that running was futile or he genuinely believed he could talk his way through this. 8 years of watching Caius operate, said it was the second one. 8 years. I gave you 8 years. You gave me a position. I built the 8 years. I trusted you with everything in this pack. Yes, Kaya said. You did. That was your choice. Not hard in the saying of it, flat, like a man presenting a ledger. The trust was real, and I used it. Those are both true at the same time, and I'm not going to pretend one cancels the other. Ryker hit him. Not a combat strike. A single open-handed blow across the face, hard enough to snap the beta's head sideways, hard enough that Caius took a step back to keep his footing. Then Ryker grabbed the front of his shirt and held him there, and for a moment the two men were very close together in the doorway, with the torchlight between them and the sound of Aldrich's breathing behind them and nothing else in the world. She's in the forest, Ryker said. My pregnant mate is in the forbidden forest in late autumn because of documents you forged. Caius met his eyes. The side of his face was already reddening. Yes, he said. Why? Because she was going to find the pattern. She was already looking. A pause. She asked about Greaves in the hall. Did you catch that? The second you named him, she made the connection. 3 more weeks and she would have traced it back. Another pause, longer. I couldn't let that happen. The pattern. Ryker's grip tightened. What pattern? Caius looked at him steadily. In his eyes, there was something that Ryker could only interpret as the particular calm of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long that setting it down feels like relief regardless of the consequences. The council is not what you think it is, Caius said. Hasn't been for 4 years. I've been managing the information you receive. What reaches you, what doesn't, which threats get elevated and which get buried. The border incidents. The trade agreements that fell through, the 3 packs on the eastern border that you believe are neutral. He stopped. Let that settle. They're not neutral. They've been in negotiation with a faction inside your own territory for 18 months, and the faction is not the Ashvale House. Ryker's grip loosened very slightly. Then who? Macon. Greaves. 4 others you haven't suspected because I made certain you wouldn't. The beta's voice stayed even. I needed the time. The Iron Hollow negotiation required a specific window, and I needed Silverfang's attention elsewhere. You were handing territory to Iron Hollow. I was positioning Silverfang for a transition that doesn't end with a war we can't win. The Eastern Packs have numbers we don't. We have 400 capable fighters. They have 1,100 across 3 territories. You've been running this pack on the assumption that our strength makes the math irrelevant. A pause. It doesn't. So your answer was to betray the pack. My answer was to survive the decade. For the first time, something moved in Caius's voice. Not anger, but the specific heat of a belief held long and hard and never once reconsidered. You are a brilliant fighter and a terrible politician, Ryker. You have been picking fights with every border pack within range for 6 years because winning feels like strength, and you have confused the two. Silverfang is going to fracture. Not might. Will. And when it does, I wanted to be on the right side of the fracture line. And Celine. The heat went out of Caius's voice. What replaced it was not guilt. It was the specific flatness of a man setting aside a feeling he has decided he cannot afford. Celine was a variable I couldn't control. She's 5 months pregnant. I know. You sent men into the forbidden forest. A pause. I needed to confirm she'd entered. You sent men to make sure she didn't come back out. Ryker said it without inflection, the way you state a thing that is so catastrophic that effect becomes impossible. Say that instead. Caius said nothing. Ryker let go of him and stepped back and stood very still for a moment with his hands at his sides, and the infirmary behind him, and the whole broken architecture of the last 6 days reorganizing itself in his mind into its actual shape. Not the shape he'd been given, not the shape that had made Celine's guilt feel like a terrible but logical conclusion, but the real shape, which was the shape of his own complete and catastrophic failure of judgment. He had not read the documents himself. He had not moved toward the table. He had stood in the hall with 40 witnesses and invoked a law that hadn't been used in 60 years because Caius had put the evidence in front of him and Macon had said the pack is watching. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath every careful constructed piece of the setup, had been Ryker's own fear. The thing he had never named, the specific dread of a man who has built his authority entirely on the premise that he cannot be deceived, confronting the possibility that he had been wrong, and choosing the verdict that let him stay certain instead of the one that required him to sit with the uncertainty. He had chosen certainty over Celine. He had chosen it over his child. He looked at Caius. "Where are your men?" he said. "The ones in the forest." "I'm not going to tell you that." "You are." "If I tell you," Caius said carefully, "you go in after her, alone, in the dark, while I'm standing here unguarded with access to everyone in this building who is still loyal to me. That's a bad tactical decision." "I'm not making a tactical decision." "I know. That's why I'm making it for you." He reached into his coat and placed something on the infirmary table, a folded paper. "Eastern Sector. 4 men, operating out of a logging camp 3 miles in." He stepped back. "I'm not a monster, Ryker. I want that said clearly. What happened to Celine was a necessary move in a situation I'd been managing for 4 years. I regret the specifics." "You regret the specifics." "I regret all of it. I made choices that made sense in the architecture I was building, and now the architecture is visible and the choices look different from the outside. That's the nature of this kind of work." A pause. "Lock me up. Do what you need to do, but go get her first, because whatever I am, I didn't account for the forest in late autumn, and she has been in there 6 days, and she is 5 months along, and those 4 men are not the only threat in those trees." Ryker picked up the paper. He looked at Caius for a long moment, at the face he had trusted without reservation for 8 years, at the steady brown eyes that had read as open and honest for so long that he had stopped reading them at all. "Secure him," he said to the warriors at the wall. He said it quietly. "Full confinement. No contact with anyone. If he speaks to someone, I want to know the words." Then he left. He was already pulling on his coat before he hit the corridor, and the paper was in his fist, and somewhere in the bottom of his chest something was moving that he hadn't let move in 6 days, something that felt like terror, which was not a thing he had ever had a good name for, because he had spent 31 years converting it into forward motion before it could be identified. He converted it now. He went out into the cold pre-dawn and crossed the yard toward the eastern gate and moved with a speed that was not quite running. The specific velocity of a man who has run out of reasons to be anything other than what the situation requires, which is faster. At the gate, Donal was still on rotation. The young warrior saw him coming and opened the gate without being asked, and as Ryker passed through, Donal said, quietly, in a voice that carried exactly far enough, "She went south, Alpha, on the 3rd night. I heard her moving from the wall." Ryker stopped. He looked at the young warrior. Donal looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what he believes and is standing on it. "South," Ryker said. "South," Donal confirmed. Ryker went south. Behind him, the eastern gate stayed open. Donal's hand on the iron bar holding it, a decision so small and so complete that it would not appear in any record of this night. Just a gate left open in the cold dark, and a young man with his hand on the bar, and the blood moon finally setting in the west, its red light going gray and thin at the edges as the night began its long pull toward morning. The forest took Ryker in. He moved through it with the particular knowledge of a man who had trained in this terrain since adolescence. Every Blackthorn heir learned the Forbidden Forest because the Forbidden Forest was the eastern defense, the natural barrier that no invading force had ever successfully crossed, and knowing it meant knowing its specific cruelties as well as its cover. He knew the slope changes. He knew where the creek fed into the lower basin. He knew the stands of old growth that provided the best shelter, and the ridgeline to the south that funneled wind into something survivable. He moved fast. He found the lean-to in 20 minutes, abandoned, bracken disturbed, the pressed outline of a body in the pine duff. He crouched over it and put his hand against the ground and felt the faint residual warmth that meant recent, which meant she was alive, which unlocked something in his chest that had been locked for 6 days and let him breathe correctly for the first time. He found the place she'd gone to ground between the 2 close-growing pines. He found the direction she'd gone from there. He followed it south. It took him another hour and a half, moving hard through terrain that wanted to cost him something at every step, before he heard it, Not her, but the four men Caius had described, moving through the trees to the west of him in a sweep formation, torches down now, working by the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the canopy. He stopped behind a tree and counted them. 4. Spread 15 feet apart, moving a search pattern. Armed, short blades and crossbows. The kind of loadout that said they weren't expecting to fight a trained alpha, but wanted the option. He looked at the crossbows. He looked at the terrain. He made a decision. He went around them. Not through... Around, wide and fast, cutting south at an angle that put him ahead of their sweep, because the only thing that mattered right now was not neutralizing a threat. It was finding Celine before the sweep did, and 4 men with crossbows were a problem he could solve later when the other problem was solved first. He ran. The sun was coming up at the edge of the tree line to the east when he found her. She was in a shallow depression at the base of a rock face, half covered with pulled bracken, sitting upright with her back to the stone and the belt knife in her hand, and her eyes on him before he'd fully cleared the tree line. 3 seconds of pure readiness in her body before she processed who she was looking at, and then the readiness didn't go away, it just changed shape. He stopped 6 feet away. She looked at him. The 6 days were on her face in a way he couldn't account for entirely. The cold, the exhaustion, the particular tightening around the eyes of someone who has been in survival mode long enough that survival has started to feel like a permanent condition, rather than a temporary one. She was thinner at the jaw. Her braid was entirely undone now, her hair loose and tangled. There was dried mud on her left cheek and her coat was dark with moisture from the ground. She was looking at him the way you look at something you are still deciding is real. "You shouldn't be in this forest," she said. Her voice was rough from cold and misuse. "There are 4 men behind you." "I know about the 4 men." "You know about—" She stopped. Something shifted in her expression. "How long have you known?" 3 hours. 3 hours. She said it quietly in a voice that gave him nothing about what it meant to her. "Who sent them?" "Caius." The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes after a confirmation rather than a revelation. The kind where a person has already built the room in their head and is now simply seeing the furniture placed. "I told you," she said. "I told you to note who verified the documents." "I know." "By name." Her voice stayed quiet. "I stood in that hall and I told you exactly where to look." "I know, Celine." "And you banished me anyway." He didn't answer. There was no answer that was also true and also adequate for what had happened, and he was not going to insult her with something that was only one of those 2 things. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he felt the full weight of it. Not judgment, not anger, though both were in there somewhere under the surface. Something more corrosive than either. The look of a person who has loved someone and watched that person choose certainty over them, and is still, 6 days later, trying to understand what that means about every prior certainty they held. "There are 4 men in the trees," she said finally, "and you came alone." "Yes." "That's a bad tactical decision." "People keep telling me that." Something moved in her face. Not forgiveness, nowhere near forgiveness. Something smaller and more immediate. The recognition that the crisis in front of them was still happening, and the reckoning behind it would have to wait. She put the knife back on her belt and got to her feet. He moved toward her and she put one hand up. Not aggressive, just a boundary, clean and clear. "I can stand," she said. He stopped. She stood. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what we're walking into." And somewhere behind them, 60 yards into the trees, one of the 4 men tripped a frozen branch, and the crack of it split the pre-dawn silence like a shot. And they both went still and looked at each other, and the reckoning stepped back one more time to make room for survival. In the stronghold, in a locked room in the lower east wing, Caius Vane sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall and his wrists bound and his eyes on the ceiling, and he was smiling, very slightly, the expression of a man who has played a long game and lost the piece he expected to lose and is already thinking about the pieces still on the board. Because Ryker had gone into the forest alone. Ryker had left the stronghold in the hands of the senior council, and the senior council, minus Macon, who had been taken into custody an hour ago, was currently sitting in the Great Hall, and two of those men owed their positions not to Ryker Blackthorn, but to Caius Vane. And in the Beta's quarters, behind the third drawer on the left, beneath the false bottom, there was still one document Ryker hadn't found. The one that wasn't a forgery. The one that already had signatures on it. The one that couldn't be undone. The branch crack was 40 yards, not 60. Ryker recalculated in the half-second after the sound. The sweep was tighter than he'd estimated, the men moving faster now that the light was improving, and 40 yards in this terrain with crossbows meant they were inside reliable range if either he or Celine broke into open ground. He looked at Celine. She was already looking at the rock face behind her, scanning it the way someone scans something they've already mapped, checking her own memory against what she was seeing. "There's a crack in the rock," she said quietly. 8 feet up, wide enough. "You're 5 months? Wide enough," she said again, and there was nothing in her voice that invited the rest of that sentence. He went up first, found the crack, hauled himself in and turned and reached down. She handed him the pack first. Then she climbed, and she climbed well. Not easily, there was nothing easy about it. Her breath came hard, and once she stopped for a second and pressed her forehead against the rock, and he felt the moment stretch tight before she moved again. But she made it, and he pulled her the last foot and a half into the crack, and they pressed flat against the cold stone with the pack between them and the pre-dawn light going pale and gray outside. Below, the first man walked through the depression where Celine had been sitting 4 minutes ago. He stopped, crouched, touched the bracken, looked up at the rock face. Ryker watched him through the gap in the stone, watched the calculation moving across the man's face, the way a trained searcher reads terrain, building the map of where a person could have gone. His eyes tracked upward along the rock. Stopped. Moved on. The crack was in shadow still, a dark gap that looked like a fissure rather than an opening from below. If you weren't looking for it, it read as solid rock. The man stood up and gestured to the others, and they spread out along the base of the outcropping and kept moving east. Ryker counted to 90 after the last footfall faded. Then he looked at Celine. She was looking at the ceiling of the crack, maybe 5 feet of stone above them, rough and damp, with the expression of someone who is regulating something internal by not looking at anything that requires response. "Caius," she said. "Yes." "The border scouts." He was feeding rotation schedules to a mercenary company. Aldrich survived, came back this morning. He identified Caius by voice. She was quiet for a moment. "The document in my rooms," she said. "The alliance promise." "Forged. He practiced your handwriting. 3 weeks, based on what Aldrich heard in the root cellar before he got out." Another silence. "Greaves and Macon," she said. "Part of it. 4 others I don't have names for yet." She turned her head and looked at him then. The first time she'd looked directly at him since he'd found her. Not the evaluating look from before, but something different. Something that was going through the situation rather than at him personally. "How many people in the stronghold can you trust?" she said. He thought about it honestly instead of reflexively. That was new. Or not new. He'd always been capable of it. But something about the last 6 days had stripped away the habit of reflexive certainty and left the slower, more accurate thing underneath. "Donal at the Eastern Gate, Petra, 4 of my senior warriors who were on border rotation when Caius built whatever he built." He paused. "Maybe 15 total, if I'm being careful." "And the rest?" "I don't know, which is the problem." "You left the stronghold," she said. Not accusatory, just noting the architecture of the situation the way she'd noted the crack in the rock. "You're in this forest, and the stronghold is running on a council that Caius has been managing for 4 years." "Yes." "And Caius is in confinement, but confinement requires someone to maintain it, and you said you didn't know who you could trust." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the specific expression of a woman who has had 6 days alone in a forest to do nothing but think, and has thought very clearly. "We need to go back," she said. "Now." Son. They came out of the forest at the southern edge, a 1/4 mile from the gate Donal was holding, moving fast and low through the last of the tree cover. The sun was up properly now, pale and cold, the frost burning off the grass and the open ground between the tree line and the wall. Celine moved well. He noted it without commenting on it, The way she'd found her footing in the forest, the way she read the terrain, the way she'd calculated the rock face and climbed it without asking for more help than was physically necessary. 6 days had done something to her that wasn't damage. Or it was damage and something else at the same time. A recalibration that happened when the comfortable version of yourself gets stripped away and what's underneath turns out to be load-bearing. He had done that to her. He held that thought for the length of the open ground, and then he put it somewhere he'd have to deal with later, because later was the only place it could go right now. Donal had the gate open before they reached it. Inside the wall, the yard was wrong, not visibly wrong. The morning routine was in motion, the kitchen smoke rising, the stable hands moving between buildings, the usual cluster of off-rotation warriors at the south corner with their hands around whatever was hot. But the specific quality of ordinary activity that conceals something else? Ryker had been reading that quality in enemy camps for 15 years, and he felt it now like a change in air pressure. "How long have I been gone?" he said to Donal. "Hour and 40 minutes, Alpha." "What's happened?" Donal looked at him. "Senior Council called an emergency session 40 minutes ago. Great Hall. I heard it from Petra." "Called by who?" "Councillor Renwick." Renwick. One of the 6 Caius had built his coalition from, if Caius's own accounting was accurate, and Ryker had no reason to doubt it, given that everything else he'd said in the infirmary had been a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long. The particular relief of someone who is finally saying the true version instead of the managed one. He looked at Celine. She said, "Go." "You need the healer." "I need the healer after you know whether the stronghold is still yours." She said it with the flatness of someone who has recently reorganized their priorities around what is survivable versus what is comfortable. "Go. I'll find Petra." He went. The Great Hall was full. Not the 40 of 6 days ago. Full, the way it filled for formal pack assemblies. Every seat at the long tables taken, standing warriors along the walls. The particular compressed energy of a large gathering that doesn't know yet whether it's a council session or something else. 160 people at least, and at the head of the Alpha's table, standing in the Alpha's position, as though the position were a jacket he'd found lying on a chair and had decided to try on, was Councillor Renwick. Renwick was 53, gray at the temples, heavy-set, with the kind of physical authority that came from size rather than anything he'd ever earned with it. He had been on the senior council for 11 years. Ryker had never particularly liked him and had never particularly disliked him, which in retrospect was its own kind of failure. Strong feelings left a residue you could work from. Indifference left nothing. Renwick was speaking when Ryker walked through the hall doors. He stopped speaking. The hall went quiet in the spreading way of a large group that has just become aware of a new variable. Ryker walked the length of the hall. Nobody moved. He could feel the specific attention of 160 people calibrating simultaneously. The ones who were with him, the ones who weren't, and the largest group, the ones who were waiting to see which way the weight fell before they committed. He stopped 10 feet from the head table. "You're in my seat," he said to Renwick. Renwick looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been caught partway through a move he hasn't finished yet and is calculating whether to complete it or withdraw. The calculation took about 3 seconds. "Alpha," he said. "We were concerned. You left without notice, without a designated second in command, given that your beta is currently in confinement, on charges of treason," Ryker said, "against Silverfang, against the Alpha line." He let that sit for a moment. Funny how that phrase sounds different depending on who it's being applied to. Something moved through the hall. Not sound exactly. More like the collective intake of breath that precedes sound. Renwick said, "The Council has a responsibility to maintain order in the Alpha's absence. That's foundational law, not... The Council doesn't call sessions without Alpha authorization. That's also foundational law." Ryker looked at him steadily. "So what we have here is a choice between 2 explanations. Either you panicked and made a procedural error, or you called an unauthorized session while I was out of the building because you had a reason to want the council assembled before I came back." He tilted his head slightly. "Which one?" The hall was completely still. Renwick's jaw worked. "I want Caius Vane released," he said. The decision in his voice was the decision of a man who has run out of the patience for the careful version. The confinement order was irregular. It was issued without council review, without evidence presented through proper channels. You have one man's testimony from a wounded scout who'd been in a root cellar for 3 weeks. That's not sufficient grounds. Caius confessed, Ryker said. In front of 4 witnesses in the infirmary, he told me what he built and why he built it and who he built it with. He paused. He named you, Renwick. The silence changed quality. Renwick's face did something complicated. I want that document, he said. His voice had gone to a different register, lower, less performance in it, the voice of someone who has abandoned the public version of the conversation. The one from the Beta's quarters, the one your men haven't found yet. And there it was, the thing Caius had said in the infirmary, sitting on the floor with bound wrists and that slight smile. There's one document they haven't found, the one that already has signatures. Ryker felt it land in his chest like something physical. You know about the document, he said. I signed the document. Renwick said it with the specific exhaustion of a man who is tired of the pretense. 6 months ago, along with Caius and 3 others. It's a provisional transfer of territorial authority in the Eastern Valley to the Iron Hollow Pack, contingent on a change of alpha leadership in Silverfang. He met Ryker's eyes. It's already been countersigned by the Iron Hollow Alpha. It's legally binding under Interpack Charter. Whether you find it or not, whether Caius sits in a cell or walks free, that document exists, and the Iron Hollow Pack knows it exists, and they are currently sitting on your eastern border with 400 fighters waiting to hear whether the contingency has been met. The hall had stopped breathing. Ryker stood very still. He understood now what Caius had meant by the pieces still on the board. Not Renwick. Renwick was a move, not the endgame. The endgame was the document. The endgame was 400 Iron Hollow fighters on the eastern border who had a signed piece of paper that told them Silverfang's eastern valley was already theirs, contingent on a thing that was supposed to have already happened, contingent on a change of alpha leadership, contingent on him being gone. Celine was supposed to have died in the forest. Ryker was supposed to be too destroyed by the subsequent discovery of his Beta's conspiracy to hold the throne through the challenge that followed. That was the architecture. It was elegant, and he could see the whole of it now, with the particular cold clarity of someone who has just understood how badly they've been played, and how long the play has been running. 6 days. He'd had 6 days to understand something that had been built over 4 years, and he'd spent most of those 6 days doing exactly what the plan required him to do. He looked at Renwick. Leave my seat, he said. Renwick said, You don't have the numbers, Ryker. Not in this room. Not with what's coming from the east. The reasonable move is a negotiated, leave my seat. I'm trying to give you a way through this that doesn't end with, Ryker moved. He crossed the 10 feet between them in 2 seconds and hit Renwick with a shoulder strike that drove the older man back into the Alpha's chair with enough force to tip it backward. And then Ryker had him by the collar, and the chair had righted itself, and Renwick was in it with Ryker's fist in his shirt, and the whole hall watching, and Ryker was not performing authority. He was not doing the calculated display of force that an alpha performs when he needs the room to remember who's in charge. This was different. This was the specific, undisguised violence of a man who has been managed and maneuvered and grieved for 6 days and has run out of the capacity to be strategic about it. Tell me where the document is, he said. Caius's quarters, Renwick said. He was not a coward, which Ryker could at least respect. His voice stayed mostly even. 3rd drawer, false bottom. You'll find it under the territorial maps. Ryker let go of him. He straightened. He looked around the hall, at the 160 people who had watched this, who were watching him now, who were in the process of deciding what it meant. Silverfang doesn't negotiate its territory, he said. Not loud. He didn't need to be loud. Not with Iron Hollow, not with anyone. Whatever that document says, whatever Caius signed, whatever Renwick countered, it was done without alpha authority, and it doesn't stand. He looked at the faces along the walls, the ones he didn't know, the ones who were still calibrating. I know some of you were brought into this. I know Caius has been building something in this pack for 4 years, and some of you didn't have a choice about how much of it you're standing in. I'm going to deal with that honestly, and I'm going to deal with it after the eastern border is secured. He paused. "But if anyone in this room moves against me or mine between now and then, I will not be dealing with it honestly. I will be dealing with it the way the first Blackthorn Alpha dealt with things, and none of you want that." The hall was silent. Then, from the wall to his left, one of his senior warriors, a woman named Garrett, 28 years old, who had served on his border detail for 4 years and had a reputation for an absolute absence of drama, stepped forward and said, "I stand with the Alpha." And then the man next to her, and the woman beside him. Not all of them. Not even most of them. Not yet. But enough. Enough that the calculus in the room shifted, and Renwick could feel it shift from where he was sitting in the Alpha's chair, and his face showed him feeling it. Ryker looked at him. "Get up," he said. Renwick got up. Ryker sat down. He sent 6 warriors to retrieve the document from the Beta's quarters, and another 12 to reinforce the eastern wall, and a rider to the northern border outpost with a message for the 3 packs Caius had told him were not neutral. A message that said, in the spare and specific language of interpack communication, that the Alpha of Silverfang was aware of the negotiations conducted on his territory's behalf without his authorization, and that the people who had conducted those negotiations were currently in custody, and therefore their authority to negotiate was retroactively void. It was not a legal argument that would hold indefinitely, but it would hold long enough. He was in the Alpha's study, going through Caius's secondary files, the ones his Beta had kept in a locked box that Ryker had the key to because Caius had given him the key, which was the kind of audacity that Ryker was only now fully appreciating. When the door opened and Celine walked in, she had found Petra. She had found the healer. The mud was gone from her face, and she had different clothes on. She still rough, practical, nothing decorative, and her hair was pulled back again in the braid that had started the story neat and was already coming loose at the temple. She stopped inside the door and looked at the room, at the open files, at him. "Healer says the child is fine," she said. "Asks me to rest, which is not happening." "I know." She crossed to the desk and looked at the files without touching them. Her eyes moved over the documents with a specific, focused speed that told him she had been doing this, processing information, building architecture, since long before tonight. "The eastern border," she said. "Reinforced. Rider sent north." The document. Being retrieved. Renwick. Confined. She nodded slowly, still looking at the files. "You're going to need the northern packs to believe you've neutralized the threat before Iron Hollow decides the contingency is close enough," she said. "That's a narrow window. Days, not weeks." "I know. And you're going to need your council to actually be your council, which means you need to know which 4 of the 6 Chaos built are still in that hall and which positions they hold, and whether any of them have independent authority to negotiate or commit pack resources without your sign-off." "I'm working on it." She reached past him and turned one of the files to face her. "Greaves has signatory authority on border trade agreements," she said. "I noticed that 14 months ago and mentioned it to Caius as something that should be reviewed." She set the file back down. "He agreed with me and did nothing about it." Ryker looked at her. She looked at him. Not the evaluating look, not the cold clarity of the last hour. Something that was none of those things and wasn't ready to be named yet. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "I want that stated plainly so we're not operating on assumptions." "Understood. What happened in the halls 6 days ago is not something I'm setting aside because the situation is complicated. It happened. It's in the record of what you are." She held his gaze. "What you do from here will also be in that record. I'm watching it go in." "I know," he said. And then, because it was true and the only thing available that was both true and worth saying, "I'm watching it go in too." She looked at him for another moment. Then she pulled the nearest chair to the desk and sat down and reached for the next file. "Show me what Greaves signed," she said. He showed her. They worked through the night, and in the lower east wing, in the locked room, Caius Vane sat with his back against the stone and listened to the footsteps in the corridor above him. The specific rhythm of a stronghold in crisis, the weight and frequency of people moving with urgency. And he listened carefully, the way he had always listened, And what he heard was not the sound of a plan collapsing. What he heard was the sound of a plan changing. He had not built everything on the document. The document was a weight on a scale. There were other weights. And the Iron Hollow Alpha, who had 400 fighters on the eastern border, and a signed piece of paper and a very specific understanding of what Silver Fang's internal chaos looked like from the outside, had not received Ryker's rider yet. The rider would take 6 hours to reach the northern outpost. 6 hours was a long time. Caius closed his eyes. In the room above him, through the floor, he could hear Ryker's voice, low and deliberate, the voice he used when he was working, not performing, and beneath it, quieter, Celine's. He had miscalculated her survival. He would not miscalculate it again. Outside the stronghold's eastern wall, at the precise border where Silverfang territory met the forest road that led to Iron Hollow land, a scout on horseback pulled up short and looked at the single torch burning at the tree line, the signal that had been agreed upon 6 months ago, the signal that meant the contingency has not been met, but the window is open. Come now or not at all. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode east. The rider reached the Iron Hollow camp in 4 hours and 40 minutes. Ryker's rider, the one carrying the message about retroactive void and unauthorized negotiations, was still 2 hours from the northern outpost when the Iron Hollow column began to move. 400 fighters. Organized, provisioned, already in formation. The kind of readiness that doesn't happen in response to a signal. It had been building for days, the column staged in the Forest Road staging ground 6 miles east of the Silverfang border, waiting for the torch. They had been waiting for the torch. The scout who'd turned his horse east had not been one of Ryker's men. Teens. Garrett came through the study door at a dead run just before the 2nd hour of morning. She didn't knock. The specific quality of her footsteps in the corridor had already told Ryker something was wrong before the door opened. The weight distribution of someone who has been running since they got the information rather than walking since they decided to deliver it. Eastern wall, she said. Column on the forest road. 400, minimum. They're not stopping at the border marker. Ryker was out of the chair before she finished the sentence. Celine looked up from the files. Go, she said. He stopped at the door. Turned. She was already on her feet, already reaching for the territorial maps. Not because she was going to fight, but because she was going to think, and thinking required the maps. And she had understood the architecture of this problem faster than anyone else in the building. He said, The lower study has a bolt from inside. Use it. I know where the bolt is. Celine. Ryker. Her voice was precise and flat and left no room. Go hold your wall. He went. The eastern wall was 30 feet of stone and timber, built by his grandfather to a standard that assumed the primary threat would be the forest, rather than an organized military column, which meant it was solid against weather and wildlife, and the occasional border dispute involving 20 or 30 fighters, and it was deeply, structurally inadequate for what was currently coming down the forest road. He could see the torches from the wall walk, a line of them, the particular compressed density of a column that has been drilled to maintain formation, moving at a pace that said they weren't worried about conserving energy for a siege because they didn't plan on this being a siege. They planned on this being an entry. Donal was on the wall. Petra. 6 of his reliables from the night rotation. 12 more had come up from the yard when word spread. Warriors who'd been off rotation, some of them still pulling their coats on. The particular disheveled urgency of men roused from sleep by something their bodies understood before their minds caught up. 20 warriors on the wall, 400 in the column. Ryker stood at the wall's edge and looked at the torches and did the arithmetic with the specific cold calculation of a man who has done this arithmetic before, in other configurations, and knows what it yields when the numbers are this bad. You don't win this fight on the wall. The wall buys you time. Time is a resource, and he needed to know what to spend it on. Garrett, he said. She was behind him. Alpha. Get into the lower east wing. Get Caius out of confinement. A pause. He heard her process it. The specific silence of a competent person absorbing an order that contradicts everything the last 6 hours have established. Alpha? He built this. He knows where the seams are. Get him out and bring him to me, and if he runs, put a blade in him. He turned from the wall long enough to look at her. Go. She went. He turned back to the column. It had covered another quarter-mile while he'd been talking. Maybe 15 minutes to the gate. The gate was iron-banded oak, 8 inches thick, designed to absorb a ram. It would hold for 3 rams before the third one took it. He knew the number because he'd tested it himself 2 years ago, because that was the kind of thing you tested when you were the kind of alpha who believed in knowing his own weak points. He knew his weak points now with a clarity that had not been available to him 8 days ago. Donal appeared at his elbow. Orders. Hold the wall. No arrows until I say. I want them to know we're here, and I want them to see we're not running. He paused. If they send a rider forward, I'll meet it. And if they don't. Ryker looked at the torches. Then we find out what we're made of, he said. It wasn't bravado. He didn't have bravado left. It had burned off somewhere between the infirmary and the forest and the study, all the performance of certainty consumed by the actual work of being uncertain and moving forward anyway. What he had instead was something quieter and more durable. The specific clarity of a man who knows exactly what he's defending and why it matters, and is no longer confused about the difference between those two things and the throne. 8 days ago, he'd confused them completely. He wasn't confused now. They sent a rider. A single horseman detached from the column at 100 yards out and came forward under a torch, which was the correct protocol for a parley demand, and Ryker went down from the wall and opened the gate himself and stood in the gap with Donal at his shoulder and waited. The rider was young, 20s, the iron hollow colors on his jacket, a short blade at his hip that he wasn't going to touch. Alpha Blackthorn, the rider said. Not disrespectful. Neutral, the voice of a man reading from a prepared text. The Iron Hollow Pack presents the signed provisional transfer agreement for the Eastern Valley Territory and requests formal acknowledgement of the contingency status. The contingency isn't met, Ryker said. The agreement specifies a change of alpha leadership in Silverfang. Our scouts report your beta in confinement, your council in crisis, and your eastern border unmanned as of 4 hours ago. The rider's voice stayed neutral. The Iron Hollow Alpha considers the contingency substantially met. The Iron Hollow Alpha can consider whatever he likes. I'm standing in my own gate. The agreement was signed by a man who didn't have the authority to sign it, in negotiation with people who didn't have the authority to negotiate it, on behalf of a pack whose alpha knew nothing about it. He let that sit. Under Interpack Charter, any territorial agreement requires alpha signatory from both parties. I didn't sign. The agreement is void. The rider blinked. Just once, quickly, the tell of someone who has been handed an argument they weren't briefed to counter. The Iron Hollow Alpha anticipated this position, he said, recovering. He asks that you consider the alternative. 400 fighters against your current wall complement. The agreement gives you the Eastern Valley with terms. The alternative gives you nothing with casualties. Tell your Alpha, Ryker said, that Silverfang doesn't negotiate under a drawn blade. That's also Interpack Charter. Tell him if he wants to negotiate, he withdraws the column to the border marker, and we talk in the morning like civilized people. Tell him if he doesn't, I'll defend this wall with what I have, and the Interpack Council will hear about an unprovoked military incursion against a sovereign territory within the week, which is a conversation the Iron Hollow Alpha does not want to have while he's in the middle of an expansion phase. He paused. Tell him I'll wait 20 minutes for his answer. The rider looked at him for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back to the column. Ryker turned to Donal. Double the wall. Everyone who can hold a weapon. Donal moved. Behind Ryker, from the direction of the lower east wing, he heard footsteps. 2 sets, one of them Garrett's, and one of them measured and unhurried in the specific way of a man who has decided how he's going to carry himself regardless of circumstances. He turned. Caius walked toward him across the yard with his wrists still bound, and Garrett 3 feet behind him with a blade he wasn't trying to create distance from. He looked at Ryker. Ryker looked at him. Iron Hollow column, Ryker said. 400. Parley rider just went back. I have 20 minutes. Caius looked at the open gate, at the darkness beyond it, at the torchline of the column visible in the distance. Wren, he said. What? The Iron Hollow Alpha's name is Wren. Aldrich Wren, 51, Came up through the Eastern Expansion 15 years ago. He's tactical, but he's not aggressive. He doesn't pick fights he isn't certain of winning. Caius looked back at Ryker. The column is a show. He's not certain. He has 400 fighters. He has 400 fighters 6 miles from his own territory in the middle of the night on the basis of a signal from a scout that told him the contingency was substantially met. Caius's voice was even, analytic, the voice of someone who has set aside everything except the problem in front of him. Substantially met is not met. Ren is a careful man. He came this far because the investment was already made, but if you give him a reason to stop that doesn't read as weakness, he'll stop. What reason? The Interpack Council argument is good. Use it harder. Caius paused. And tell him Celine is alive. Ryker looked at him. The contingency was a change of alpha leadership. Ren's version of that assumed you'd be too broken by the sequence of events to hold the throne. The Luna's betrayal, the Beta's exposure, the council crisis. A man who walks back into his stronghold with his mate alive, and his Beta in custody, and his council purged inside of one night is not a broken man. A pause. Ren doesn't know Celine survived the forest. If he did, he'd know the sequence didn't go the way it was supposed to. He'd know he's looking at a pack that's been tested and is still standing. That's a different calculation. The yard was quiet except for the sound of warriors moving on the wall above them. Ryker said, "Why are you helping me?" Caius met his eyes. The answer took a moment to come, and when it came, it had the quality of something true that the speaker has not said aloud before. "Because I built something for 4 years, and it was supposed to be better than what you were doing, and it wasn't," he said. "It was just different damage." He looked at the gate. "And because Celine is alive and in that building, and if Iron Hollow takes this wall, she doesn't stay that way." The 20 minutes were up. The column started moving. Dietz. Ryker went back through the gate. He went alone, which Donal objected to with a single sharp sound that wasn't quite a word, and Ryker walked through it without stopping because there are moments when the only move that means something is the one that costs you the safety net. When you need the other person to see that you have put yourself in a position where the only direction is forward. He had learned this from his father, who had been a worse man than him in most respects, and a better tactician in several. "You want someone to stop," his father had said. "Show them what it costs you to ask." He walked out to 50 yards from the column and stopped and stood there alone in the dark with the torches coming toward him, and let them come until they were close enough that he could see the Iron Hollow Alpha's face in the front rank. Aldrich Wren was 51 and looked it, weathered, broad, with the specific bearing of a man accustomed to being the largest threat in the immediate vicinity. He pulled up his horse 20 feet out and looked down at Ryker. "Bold," Wren said. "Efficient," Ryker said. "I don't want to yell." Something moved in the older man's face, not warmth, consideration. "You're alone," Wren said. "I'm not negotiating from behind a wall. Neither are you." He looked up at the man steadily. "My Luna is alive. The contingency isn't met and isn't going to be. The man who signed your document is in custody and has no authority I've ever granted him, and the Interpack Council will confirm that in writing within the week." He paused. "You've got 400 fighters 6 miles from home in the middle of the night on the basis of a forger's word. I'm not saying that to embarrass you. I'm saying it because you're a careful man and you came here on the assumption that the situation was further along than it is, and it's not, and we both need to make a decision about what happens next that we can live with in the morning." Wren looked at him for a long time. "Your Luna," he said, "survived the Forbidden Forest. 6 days, 5 months along. She's in my study right now, going through my Beta's files." He held Wren's gaze. "She's going to be the one sitting across from the Interpack Council when this gets documented. I'd rather that documentation say that Iron Hollow withdrew to the border marker when presented with accurate information about the contingency status. I'd rather not have it say something else." The column had gone still behind Wren, 400 fighters, torches burning, waiting. Wren said, "The Eastern Valley Agreement. Void. But I'll tell you what's not void. The Trade Access Silverfang has been blocking on the Northern Forest Road for 2 years. That was Caius managing information I wasn't getting. That blockage goes away the minute this column goes back to the border marker." Ren's eyes narrowed. That's not a small concession. No, Ryker said. It's not. Another long silence. Then Ren looked back at his column and then at Ryker, and then he made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't agreement exactly, but was the noise of a calculation resolving. Border marker, he said. Tonight. We talk at dawn. He turned his horse. The column began to move back. Ryker stood in the dark and watched 400 torches pull away from him and felt something in his chest that was not relief. It was too raw for relief, too close to the surface. Something more like the specific physical sensation of having been at the absolute limit of what your body can do and finding out, against your own expectation, that the limit was further out than you thought. He walked back to the gate. Donal was there. Garrett was there. 6 warriors who had been on the wall and come down when the column turned. Nobody said anything. Then Donal said very quietly, "That was something." "That was luck and a trade concession," Ryker said. "Don't tell anyone it was something." He went back inside. The stronghold worked through the rest of the night. Ryker pulled Greaves out of his quarters at the 3rd hour and put him in a room with 2 warriors and the signed documents that bore his name and let the documents do the talking, and Greaves talked for 40 minutes straight in the particular rapid, breathless way of a man trying to negotiate the difference between conspiracy and circumstance. What he gave them filled in the last of the gaps, the names of the other 3 council members, the timeline of the negotiation, the specific mechanism by which Caius had been feeding border intelligence to the mercenary company. By the 4th hour, Ryker had the full shape of it. It was, he had to admit, impressive. Not in any way that he could hold without disgust, not in any way that changed what it was, but impressive the way a structural failure is impressive when you see the engineering that went into producing it. 4 years of careful, patient, invisible work. The way it had used his own certainty against him, his own habit of trusting Caius completely because trusting Caius completely had never cost him anything before. The trust was real, Caius had said, and I used it. He went to Celine with the last file at the 5th hour of morning. She was still at the desk, still working, the territorial map spread in front of her with notes in her precise, distinctive handwriting at the margins. She looked up when he came in. "Column withdrew," he said. "I heard." She had found Petra at some point. There was a cup of something warm on the desk that hadn't been there before, and she was drinking it in the careful, automatic way of someone who has been reminded by a third party that the body requires maintenance. Ren agreed to dawn negotiations? Border marker. He wants the Northern Road access. He should have had it 2 years ago. Caius was blocking trade arguments that I brought to council 6 months after I arrived here. She looked back at the maps. I didn't know why at the time. I thought it was a border relations philosophy difference. A pause. I should have pushed harder. You shouldn't have had to push at all. She was quiet. He stood in the middle of the study with the file in his hand and the 5th hour of morning, making the windows gray and the cedar smell from her things that someone had brought down from her rooms in the east wing present in the air. And he felt the weight of the last 8 days in his body, the way you feel a long exertion after the adrenaline recedes. Not pain exactly, but the full accounting of it, every hour tabulated. I'm going to stand before the pack, he said. Full assembly. Everything that happened, stated plainly and in front of witnesses. What I did, and why, and what it cost. He set the file on the desk. I should have done it 6 days ago instead of invoking blood moon law. She looked at the file. Yes, she said, you should have. I'm going to do it now. She looked up at him then, not with forgiveness, not yet, not anywhere near yet, but with something that was paying attention to him rather than at the situation, which was different. What do you want from me? She said. It was a precise question, and it deserved a precise answer. I want you to be there when I say it, he said. Not beside me, wherever you decide to stand, but there. He paused. I want you to hear it said in front of everyone because it was said in front of everyone when it should have been unsaid. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close. But it was the specific opening that comes when 2 people who have been in opposition about something fundamental reach the point where the opposition becomes a conversation instead of a wall. And Ryker understood exactly how much work stood between this moment and anything that could be called restored. He understood it the way he understood the Eastern Wall, its real strength and its real vulnerabilities, and what it would cost to rebuild it properly. He was going to do the work. He sat down on the other side of the desk and reached for the nearest file, and they worked until the sun came all the way up and the stronghold woke around them, and the day that was going to require everything they had arrived with the specific, indifferent punctuality of days that don't care what condition you're in when they get there. At the 6th hour, Garrett knocked on the study door. "Assembly's ready," she said. "Full pack, Eastern Yard." Ryker looked at Celine. She stood, smoothed her coat, checked the braid at her temple with one hand and left it loose when it came loose again, with the specific gesture of someone who has decided the braid is a lower priority than it used to be. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back to look at him. Just for a second, just long enough. "Don't make me regret being in that yard," she said. Then she walked out. He stood up. His body hurt in the specific, detailed way of someone who has not slept and has been in 2 confrontations and has carried the structural weight of a crumbling institution through one very long night. His jaw ached where he'd been clenching it. His hands were steady, which surprised him slightly. He walked to the door. He walked out into the corridor that smelled of cedar and old stone. And the morning was coming through the high windows in long, pale bars. And somewhere below him the full pack of Silverfang was assembled in the Eastern Yard, waiting for their alpha to come down and say something true to them, possibly for the first time in a very long time. He went down. At the bottom of the stairs, in the corridor outside the lower east wing, the door to Caius's confinement room stood open. The 2 warriors who had been guarding it were on the floor, not dead, breathing, the particular stillness of men who had been hit from behind with something heavy. The room was empty. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay the cut ends of the rope that had bound Caius Vane's wrists, and outside, beyond the southern wall, faint with distance but unmistakable, the sound of a horse, already at a gallop, moving fast and getting faster, putting ground between itself and Silverfang with the specific, practiced urgency of a man who has known for 8 years exactly which gate was least watched, and which guard was most reliable, and which moment in a crisis was the one where everyone's attention pointed in exactly the wrong direction. Ryker stood in the empty room. He looked at the cut ropes. He looked at the open door. He thought, he planned for this too. And then, from above him, from the Eastern Yard where the full pack of Silverfang was assembled and waiting, he heard a sound he couldn't immediately identify. A collective sound, the particular quality of a large group of people reacting to something they had not expected to see. He ran back up the stairs. He came out into the Eastern Yard and stopped. Because at the far end of the yard, beyond the assembled pack, beyond the open eastern gate where the dawn was coming in cold and flat and silver, on the forest road, riding toward the gate at a walk that was the specific, deliberate pace of a man who wants to be seen arriving, was Caius Vane. Beside him, matching that pace, were 40 riders in Iron Hollow colors. And behind those 40 riders, behind Caius and his stolen horse, and the column that had been at the border marker 20 minutes ago and was now inside the gate, Aldrich Wren sat on his horse with his eyes on Ryker across the full width of the yard, with the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the negotiation he agreed to at the border marker was not the real negotiation. The real negotiation had been Caius, riding south in the dark, reaching the Iron Hollow camp with something in his hand that was worth more than a border marker withdrawal. The document that wasn't a forgery, the one with signatures already on it, the one Ryker had sent 6 warriors to retrieve from the 3rd drawer and the false bottom and had never confirmed was actually in hand because he'd been on the eastern wall when they went for it, and nobody had reported back yet, because nobody had known it mattered enough to interrupt him. He looked at Caius across the yard. Caius looked back at him with the face of a man who has made a decision he's going to have to live in for a long time and has already begun the process of making his peace with it. "I told you," Caius said, across the silence of the full pack between them, "that what you do in the next 5 minutes is going to determine the next 5 years." The yard was absolutely silent. 400 Iron Hollow fighters outside the gate, 40 inside it. Caius on his horse, Ren on his. The full pack of Silverfang in between, turning their heads between their alpha at one end of the yard and the beta who had built 4 years of careful architecture at the other. And Ryker Blackthorn stood in the eastern yard of his own stronghold, with the morning coming in and everything he had spent 8 days fighting for balanced on the edge of the next 30 seconds, and the specific, clarifying terror of a man who has run out of time descended on him like the cold. He looked at Celine. She was standing to the left of the yard, 20 feet back, with Petra at her shoulder and her hand flat against her belly, and her eyes on him. Not afraid, not begging, not anything he could easily name. Just watching, waiting to see what the record of who he was going to show next. He looked back at Caius. He took one step forward. Ryker took one step forward and stopped. Not because he was afraid. The fear was there. He could feel it at the base of his throat, the specific cold tightness of a man looking at a situation that has more wrong answers than right ones. But fear had never been the thing that stopped him. What stopped him now was something he hadn't had 8 days ago. The deliberate, effortful pause of a man who has learned, at significant cost, to look at a thing clearly before he moves toward it. He looked at Caius on the horse. He looked at Ren behind him, with the 40 riders in Iron Hollow colors and the full column outside the gate. He looked at the pack between them. 200 people who had been assembled to hear their alpha make a public confession and were instead watching something that hadn't been scheduled, something that carried the particular atmospheric charge of a situation that could resolve into violence faster than any of them could move. He looked at Celine. She was watching him with her hand flat against her belly and her eyes steady, and what was in those eyes was not instruction and not fear and not hope exactly. It was the look of someone who has already decided that what happens next belongs entirely to him, that she has carried enough of his consequences and will not carry this one, that this moment and everything in it is his to answer for. He understood her. He turned back to Caius. "You rode to Ren," he said. His voice carried across the yard without effort, not raised, just aimed. "In the dark, with the document." "Yes," Caius said, "and Ren came back inside my gate." Ren spoke from behind Caius, his voice level and carrying the specific quality of a man who is performing neutrality while he waits to see how the math resolves. The document is legally binding under Interpact Charter. Caius Vane presented it with full provenance. "I have a right to—" "You have a right to nothing inside my walls without my consent," Ryker said. Still not loud. He walked forward through the pack and the pack parted for him, the specific unconscious movement of a large group that has decided in the aggregate which direction the authority is pointing. "You rode to a man I told you was in custody for treason, and you took his word over mine inside my own gate. That's a decision that has consequences under Interpact Charter too." He stopped 20 feet from Ren's horse. "So before we talk about documents, let's talk about what you've just done, and whether it's something you want on record." Ren's jaw tightened. The situation is that you're inside my wall because a man I locked up for conspiracy against the Alpha Line told you to come in." Ryker looked at him steadily. "Walk that back for me. Explain to the Interpact Council how that reads." The yard was very quiet. Ren looked at Caius. Caius was looking at Ryker with the expression of a man who has run a complex calculation and is watching the answer come out differently than projected. Not panic. He wasn't built for panic. Something more like the specific, sober attention of someone recalibrating. "The document stands," Caius said. "The document was signed by you," Ryker said, "on behalf of a pack you don't own, in a negotiation you conducted using intelligence you stole and forged evidence you created, and a position you held because I trusted you." He stopped 2 feet from Caius's horse. This close, he could see the cut on Caius's wrist where the rope had been. The skin raw, slightly torn, the mark of someone who had spent time working the knot rather than waiting for rescue. He'd known. He'd known Ryker would go to the wall and the study door would be unwatched for the specific window he needed. "I want the document." "It's already been presented to Ren. You can't—" "I want it now, Caius." A long beat. Caius reached into his coat and withdrew the folded pages. The document that wasn't a forgery, the one with real signatures. The one that had Ren's countersign and 3 counselors' names and the territorial transfer language that had been building toward this moment for 4 years. He looked at it for a second. Then he held it out. Ryker took it. He turned to face the full pack, 200 people, the whole of Silverfang, the warriors and the kitchen staff, and the healers and the stable hands and the pups who'd been brought out because the assembly was mandatory and had been pressed to the edges of the yard by their older siblings, and were watching everything with the enormous eyes of children who understand that something important is happening without understanding what. He held the document up so the pack could see it. Then he tore it in half. The sound it made was small, paper tearing, nothing dramatic. But the yard responded to it like something larger, a collective exhale, the sound a room makes when a pressure that's been building releases. He handed the 2 pieces to Donal, who was at his shoulder. "Burn it." Donal took it. Ryker turned to Ren. "The northern road access opens tomorrow," he said. "Formally, in writing, with my signature and a council witness. That's the trade concession I offered you at the border marker, and it stands." He paused. "I want your column back on your side of the border by sundown. I want it on record with the Interpack Council that Iron Hollow withdrew peacefully when presented with accurate information about the document's validity. I want your riders out of my yard in the next 10 minutes. He looked at the older man directly. "And I want you to know that what happened here tonight is something I'm willing to leave at this border, because you were given falsified context and made decisions accordingly, and I understand that. But what happened here tonight is also something I will remember with perfect clarity for the rest of my tenure as Alpha of this territory." Ren held his gaze for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," Ren said. "I know," Ryker said. "I'm not what I expected either." Something moved in the older man's face. Not warmth, not precisely. Recognition, maybe. The specific look of one experienced person seeing something real in another and noting it despite the circumstances. He turned his horse. He rode out. The 40 Iron Hollow riders went with him, and the column outside the gate began to move, and in 10 minutes the eastern yard held only Silverfang, and the gate was closed, and the morning was fully up, pale and cold and indifferent, the way mornings are, the way the world continues regardless of what the people in it spend their nights surviving. Ryker turned to Caius. Caius was still on the horse, alone now, with the yard of his own pack surrounding him, and no riders at his back, and the document gone, and the specific stripped quality of a man who has played the last card in a hand he built over 4 years and watched it taken. He dismounted. He stood in the yard and looked at Ryker and didn't perform anything. No calculation, no management, no careful neutrality. Just a man at the end of something, standing in it. "What happens now?" Caius said. "You stand trial," Ryker said, "in front of the full council, with witnesses and documentation and every name you gave me last night in that infirmary. You answer for the border scouts. You answer for the forged documents. You answer for the forest." He paused. "You answer for Celine." Caius looked across the yard. Celine was still standing where she'd been standing, to the left, 20 feet back, with Petra at her shoulder. She was looking at Caius with the specific, measured look of someone who has moved past anger into something colder and more permanent. Not hatred. Something more like the look of a person who has integrated a terrible thing into their understanding of the world and is no longer surprised by it, which is its own kind of damage and its own kind of strength. Caius held her gaze for a moment. He said to her rather than to Ryker, "I regret the forest." Celine said nothing. "I know that's not sufficient." "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a verdict rather than arguing it. Garrett took him back to confinement, and this time Ryker detailed 4 guards rather than 2 and checked the room himself before the door closed. Then he went back to the eastern yard where the pack was still assembled, still waiting, still watching him with the particular collective attention of people who have been through a long night together and are waiting to understand what it means. He stood at the front of the yard. He stood there for a moment without speaking, and what he felt standing there, in front of 200 people who served under him and trusted him, and had watched him banish a pregnant woman into a deadly forest 8 days ago on forged evidence, was not the clean, clarifying version of accountability that he might have imagined if he'd ever allowed himself to imagine this moment. It was worse than that. It was the specific, unglamorous weight of being completely, consequentially wrong in a way that cannot be retroactively improved. The thing you cannot perform your way out of or fight your way through. The thing that just sits there, demanding to be held. 8 days ago, he said, I stood in the great hall and I accused my mate of treason. I invoked blood moon law. I banished her into the forbidden forest in late autumn, 5 months pregnant, on the basis of evidence I did not examine myself and testimony I did not challenge. He stopped. Let that sit exactly as long as it needed to sit. The evidence was forged. The testimony was manufactured. The conspiracy that produced both of those things was built inside my own counsel by my own beta over 4 years, using the trust I gave him without condition and the certainty I had about my own judgment that turned out to be the most dangerous thing in this building. Another pause. I was wrong, not misled. Wrong. Because I had the information I needed to be less certain, and I chose certainty anyway, because certainty was easier than what sitting with the doubt would have cost me. And that choice nearly cost Celine her life. Nearly cost my child their life. Did cost 3 border scouts 3 weeks in a root cellar, and one of them is in the infirmary right now because of what that cost him. The yard was absolutely still. I'm telling you this, he said, not because telling you fixes it. It doesn't. I'm telling you because what happens in this territory from here forward is going to be built on an accurate accounting of what happened before, or it's not going to hold. Structures built on managed truth don't stand. I know that now in a way I didn't know it 8 days ago. And the fact that it took this to teach me it is something I will carry for the rest of my time as alpha of this pack. He looked across the yard, at the faces he knew and the ones he didn't, and the pups at the edges watching with their enormous eyes. That's all I have to say. He stepped back. The yard stayed quiet for a moment. Then Donal, young, 23, still slightly homesick for his mother's cooking, said, We stand with you, Alpha. Not loud, just said it, the way you say a thing because it's true, and the truth of it is more important than the performance of it. And then others. Not all at once, not in the organized swell of a scripted moment. Gradually, the way genuine things build. One voice, then a gap, then 3 more. Then the kitchen girl who had pressed herself against the wall 8 days ago and said Luna in a very small voice, and now said something to the woman beside her that wasn't meant to carry but did. She came back. She actually came back. Celine was walking across the yard. She walked toward Ryker with the same walk she'd used leaving the hall 8 days ago. No dramatics, no performance, just her boots on stone and her braid coming loose at the temple and her hand resting briefly, automatically, against the curve of her belly. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him. That was true, she said. Yes. All of it. Yes. She held his gaze. It doesn't fix it. I know. You said that up there. I want you to know I heard it. She looked at him steadily. I'm not standing here because I've forgiven you. I'm standing here because this is my pack too, and I'm not going to let what you did drive me out of something that's mine, not permanently. A pause. The forgiveness is a separate thing, and it moves at its own pace, and you don't get to rush it. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. What are you asking? He thought about it honestly. The same honesty he'd applied to the question of how many people in the stronghold he could trust. The slower and more accurate version rather than the reflexive one. I'm asking to earn back the right to stand next to you, he said. Not be given it. Earn it. I know the difference now. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, Then start earning. She turned and walked back toward the stronghold, and Petra fell in beside her, and the yard began to move around them. The ordinary resumption of an interrupted morning, people returning to what they'd been doing before the night happened. The specific, unglamorous persistence of a community that has been through something and is continuing anyway. The trial of Caius Vane took 11 days. It was thorough and it was documented, and it was conducted in the Great Hall with witnesses from 3 neutral territories observing at Interpack Council requirement. Every name Caius had given in the infirmary was examined. Every document was verified. Greaves testified under oath. 2 of the other 4 council members cooperated in exchange for reduced sentences. The remaining 2 did not cooperate and were dealt with accordingly. Caius testified for 4 days. He was precise and complete, and he didn't minimize anything, which Ryker had not expected, and which the neutral observers noted in their documentation with the specific attention paid to things that are unusual. He named names and dates and methods and amounts. He reconstructed the 4 years of architecture with the same careful clarity he'd used to build it, because apparently Caius Vane's particular character expressed itself the same way regardless of which direction it was pointing. If he was going to do something, he was going to do it completely. His sentence was exile from Silverfang territory, permanent, with interdiction notice filed with the Interpack Council. He left on the 12th day with a horse and a pack and the clothes he was wearing, and Ryker watched him ride out through the southern gate and felt the specific, unsatisfying weight of a conclusion that is correct and insufficient at the same time. He had asked Celine the night before what she wanted the sentence to be. She had been quiet for a long moment. "I want him gone," she said. "I don't want to build the next thing on top of his execution. That's not what I want the record to show we did." He had looked at her. "What do you want the record to show?" "That we were better than what happened to us," she said. "Eventually. It takes time." The Northern Road opened 3 weeks after Wren's column withdrew. The paperwork was signed in the Alpha's study with 2 witnesses and a council member who was one of 7 new appointments Ryker made in the restructured council. 7 new people, chosen by a process that Celine had designed and Ryker had adopted without modification, because it was better than anything he would have built, and he knew it, and said so. That was new too. Saying so. She had looked at him when he said it, a brief, evaluating look. And then she'd gone back to the document she was working on, but something had shifted in the room's quality that he'd learned to read by then. The millimeter of ground that trust returns on, when it returns. Not in declarations, not in gestures, but in the accumulation of small, accurate things, each one placed carefully, the way you rebuild a wall that failed not by covering the failure, but by understanding why the original stones were wrong and choosing different ones. He was choosing differently. It was harder than he'd expected and more important than he'd understood. And some days the gap between where they were and where they'd been before the blood moon felt like something that would never fully close. And some days it felt like the closing of it was the wrong goal anyway. That what was being built now, on the honest ground of what had actually happened, was more solid than anything built on the ground that had existed before. He held both of those things at the same time. That was new too. The twins were born on a morning in early spring when the frost had finally broken and the first green was coming up through the mud in the yards and the air smelled of cold earth and the particular promise of things resuming. Celine labored for 9 hours, which the healer called straightforward, with the specific clinical understatement of someone who has attended enough births to have a working definition of straightforward that would alarm a civilian. Ryker was there for all 9 hours. He had asked if she wanted him there, and she had said yes without qualifying it, which he understood was its own kind of statement about where things stood. He held her hand when she needed it and got out of the way when she didn't, and said almost nothing for 9 hours because there was nothing to say that was more important than being present and saying it correctly with his body rather than his mouth, which he was learning, slowly, was the version that counted. The twins were born 20 minutes apart, a boy first, then a girl. They were small and loud and entirely uninterested in the political circumstances of their arrival. The healer cleaned them and wrapped them and handed them to Celine, and Celine held them both against her chest and looked down at them with the specific, devastated expression of someone encountering something too large for the face to process normally. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but the full complex weight of 2 lives that had survived everything their parents had put them through without anyone asking their permission. Ryker sat on the edge of the cot beside her and looked at his children. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry they started this way." Celine looked at him. "They started alive," she said. "That's what they got from the start." He held that. She looked back at the twins. "You can hold her." He took his daughter with the careful, slightly rigid handling of a man who has held very few infants and is acutely aware of every way he might do it wrong. She was astonishingly light. She made a sound that wasn't quite a complaint, more like a notation, a brief editorial on the change of circumstance. and then settled against his chest with the absolute boneless trust of something that has not yet learned to distrust anything. He sat with that for a long time. There is a particular quality to the moment when a person who has spent their life defining themselves by what they can withstand encounters something that asks them to be gentle instead, not as a performance, not as a concession, but as the actual appropriate response to what's in front of them. Ryker had built 31 years on the premise that strength was the answer to everything the world put in front of him. He sat in the healer's room with his daughter against his chest and understood, in a way that was not a revelation because revelations are loud and this was quiet, that strength was the wrong category. That the thing the world was asking him to be right now was careful. That careful was not less than strong, that it was in fact considerably harder. He had a lot of years of being strong. He was going to spend the rest of them learning to be careful. The months after the births moved the way recovery moves, not in a straight line, not according to any schedule, with setbacks that arrived without warning and progress that was only visible in retrospect. The new council found its footing. The Northern Road opened trade that benefited both Silverfang and Iron Hollow, and the interpack relationship that had begun as a near invasion recalibrated over a series of formal meetings into something that wasn't yet alliance but was no longer threat. 3 other border packs that Chaos had listed as neutrals who weren't reached out, one by one, to establish legitimate contact with the Alpha's office, which now meant Ryker and Celine both, the dual signature that Ryker had formalized 3 weeks after the births in a council session where he had simply stated that the Luna Queen's authority was equal to the Alpha's and was now reflected in the governance documents accordingly, and then looked around the room for objections. There had been none. Not because no one had them, because the room understood by then what it cost to object to Celine Ashvale's authority in a space where her survival had recently been the most visible fact in the territory's recent history. She had walked into the Forbidden Forest pregnant and alone and walked back out. The pack had its own relationship with that fact, independent of anything Ryker said or didn't say about it, and that relationship expressed itself in the specific, wordless way packs express things. In the way people moved around her, in the way the kitchen girl, who had said Luna in a small voice 8 days ago, now said it in a different register entirely. In the way Aldrich, recovered, back on duty, the scar on his side still pulling when the weather was cold, had reportedly told 3 separate people that the Luna had been right about Greaves months before any of the rest of them, and he was putting that on record. Celine heard about this and said nothing about it, which was itself a statement about who she was. She didn't collect vindication. She kept working. The governance restructuring, the trade framework, the border relations that had been managed badly for years and needed the kind of slow, careful attention that Ryker was learning to give things but that Selani had always known how to give. They worked alongside each other. Some days the distance between them was exactly what it needed to be, and some days it was too much, and neither of them said so directly because that was not who either of them was, but they were learning new languages for the things they didn't say directly, and those languages were more accurate than the direct versions would have been. Trust doesn't return the way it leaves. It leaves all at once, in a single catastrophic moment, and it returns the way winter returns to spring, so gradually that you can't point to the day it changed, only to the fact that one morning the ground is different than it was, and you know at some point something shifted and the shift is real, even if the moment of it is invisible. One evening, late in the season, Celine came to find him in the Alpha's study where he was working through the eastern boundary documentation that Greaves had let accumulate in disarray, and she stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and he looked up and she came and sat in the chair across from the desk, not beside him, not yet, that was still some distance away, and she said, "I had a thought about the Eastern Valley land use." "Tell me," he said. She told him. It was a good thought. He said so. She looked at him. "You've gotten better at that," she said. "At what?" "Saying when something is good that isn't yours." She held his gaze. "It used to take you longer." He thought about that. "It's still not easy," he said. "I know. That's why I'm noting it." They sat in the study with the fire going and the twins asleep in the rooms above them and the eastern boundary documentation spread across the desk. And outside the window, the Silverfang territory was quiet, in the particular way of a community that has been through something hard and is still here, not unmarked, not unchanged, but continuous, which is its own kind of achievement and which looks from the outside like ordinary evening but is not. He looked at Celine across the desk. He looked at her the way he had not looked at anything in a long time, without certainty, without the habit of knowing, with the actual openness of someone who is still learning the person in front of him and knows it and finds it, despite everything, worth the effort. She looked back at him, not with forgiveness, or not only with forgiveness, which had come the way trust comes, invisibly and without announcement, and which she had not declared because Celine Ashvale did not declare things she showed, but with the specific quality of presence that a person extends when they have decided, against the full evidence of what someone has cost them, that the person is still worth being present for. It was not the relationship they'd had before. It was more. Not more comfortable, more real, harder and more load-bearing, built on ground that had been tested and had held, which is the only kind of ground worth building on. But in the place where the blood moon had hung over the forest on the night of the banishment, the autumn came and went, and the snow fell, and the snow thawed, and the spring came again, and in the spot on the eastern side of the stronghold wall, where Celine's moon ring lay buried under the frost and the season's debris, a tree pushed through. Nobody had planted it. It was a young thing, slender, silver-barked, the kind of tree that takes a long time to be substantial. In 10 years, it would be a presence. In 20, it would be the kind of tree that pups climbed and warriors sat under at the end of a long rotation, and old people looked at and said, "I remember when that was nothing." Donal found it first, on a morning patrol, and stood looking at it for a while before he went in and told Petra, who told the kitchen girl, who told 3 other people before the end of the day. Celine heard about it from Petra. She went to look at it that evening, alone, in the particular quiet of the hour before the stronghold lit its night fires. She stood in front of it for a while. It was barely taller than her shoulder. Its bark was the color of old silver, and it had put out 4 small leaves in the warming air, and it was growing in the exact spot where she had set down the moon ring and walked through the gate into the dark. She put her hand against the bark. She stood there for a while. What she thought, standing there with her hand against the young tree and the silver fang wall at her back, and the forest road visible in the middle distance, was not the thought she might have predicted herself thinking. Not about what had been lost or what had been restored or the accounting of cost and recovery that she had been running in the back of her mind for the better part of a year. She thought, things that survive the winter grow differently than things that don't have to. She thought, that's not a comfort exactly, it's just true. She thought, it's enough. She took her hand away from the bark. She turned and walked back through the gate, and the tree stood behind her in the evening light, putting out its 4 small leaves, doing the slow and patient work of becoming what it was going to be.